to another episode of the Community Development Podcast, doing what it says on the tin, connecting the community development workforce, sharing its learning and promoting the value of the approach. My name is Russell Todd and I am at the Victoria Youth Centre in Wrexham Town Centre, also known as the Vic, and I am with Mike Barclay. Hello Mike.
Hiya.
We're going to sort of discuss Playwork as community development, and the sort of context to this was that with my work hat on, which is in Community's First Second Project Programming Wales, and you with your Wrexham Council hat on, we're working on a piece of work around trying to better capture, better articulate some of the social benefits of Playwork, and there was a whole piece of work that's been done and everything else. I'm not going to kind of talk about that now, but as part of the brief there was a sentence there that really captured my imagination and made me kind of sort of stop in my tracks as I was reading the brief that we were collaborating on at the time. And it was that Playwork might best be understood as play-centred community development, and it was used that community development term, which I see a lot, and sometimes you go, is it really? Is that the term you need? Is that the term you actually mean? As well intended as that is. And I'd never conceived of it in that sort of context. So we did a whole load of other stuff, a whole load of other work, been really, really busy with it. And what we thought we'd do is get together without the work hat and badge and ID on and lanyard and the rest of it, to kind of just investigate this a bit more. And if there's an appetite in people hearing it, then even better. So that's where we are. What do people need to know about you, Mike?
Well, I have three main roles in relation to children's play and play work. One, I'm a dad, so working in some support or not of children's play on a daily basis. But then I run an organisation called Ludicology with Ben Towell. Ludicology means a study of playfulness, so that's what that organisation is really about, and we provide advice, research and training around children's play, and that's really about supporting anybody that's working with or on behalf of children to better understand children's playfulness and therefore how we work with them. But I'm also the play sufficiency lead for Wrexham Council, so I manage Wrexham Council's play development team, and I support and manage a lot of playwork provision. And I've only ever been a play worker. I've managed to make a career out of being a play worker, and there's not a lot of people who can say that, because there's not many play workers.
Man and boy.
Yeah. And so play work is a real passion of mine. I think the play work profession has a lot of value that isn't widely recognised.
Kind of feel similar in terms of Communities First. That's pretty much, and community development is pretty much all I've done actually. My first community development role was actually one I stumbled into, like a lot of us, in Wrexham, up in Hightown. So, put the work hat back on. Whenever there's work with Communities First in Wrexham, it probably holds a slightly sort of closer place to my heart than other CF areas, which I might get lynched for saying on air if anyone from Communities First hears this. But I cut my teeth up there, made some dreadfully embarrassing kind of blunders and mistakes looking back.
I'm still making those.
Indeed, and so it's always nice to come back as well. So this phrase, play work as play-centred community development.
Yeah, it's something that I've been thinking about for quite a while, and I think really for a lot of people who are in the UK who have been in playwork for a long time, this is really the way that within playwork a lot of those people would have thought about it. But I suppose to make sense of it, we should start talking about what playwork is about. And in terms of what playworkers do, they are first and foremost concerned with supporting children's right to play. So the outcome of playwork, ideally, is more playing. Playwork is concerned with the child's agenda of playing, which is pretty unique, really. If you look at most adults who work with children, they usually, and this isn't to diminish their roles at all, but they usually come with some form of adult desired outcome. They are working with children towards some future developmental outcome, and playwork isn't. Playwork is concerned about whether children are able to play as a kind of everyday part of their lives. And so, primarily, in simple terms, playwork is about enabling and supporting children's play. But then when you think about how do you go about supporting children's play and think about the realities of children's play, most people, through their own childhoods or from having children or knowing children, would recognise that children play in all kinds of places. children don't just play in these kind of designated times and spaces where playworks might be. So playworks often, they run adventure playgrounds or play schemes, and those places are great for playing, but they're not all of children's play lives by any means. And actually, if we wanted to really support children's play, it would be about making sure that children could easily find time and space for playing wherever they find themselves, whether it's at home or out on the street or on the way to school or down by the shops. Really, in those communities where children rate very high satisfaction with playing, you find examples of them playing all over the place. Yeah. And really that leads you to think about it's more about developing the conditions for playing rather than it is only about specific provision. Right. How do we cultivate more favourable conditions so that children can find time and space for playing? And that's where I think we start to look at this kind of community development role, because I think play workers, when they're at their best, are looking at how do you cultivate a culture of playing throughout a whole community. Yeah. And certainly some of the best play work I've seen, and I'm really proud to say that I've seen it in Wrexham, is those places where play workers are right in amongst their communities. Yet they might have a designated place, a kind of a junk playground which offers certain things, but they're also right in the middle of their communities. They're involved in community celebrations, they're playing hide and seek on estates, they're cleaning up patches of grass, they're temporarily taking over a street, creating that kind of sense that children's play is welcome in this community. And I think in that way, play workers are doing community development work. They are trying to develop communities that are supportive of play, so that their focus is always on improving conditions for playing. Yeah. But through doing that, I think we get all kinds of other benefits as well.
Because what's interesting is that, as you describe it like that, to me, it seems actually quite sort of patently obvious, actually. And you kind of think, why had that not really occurred to me so clearly or obviously previously? And I think it's because maybe it's that interpretation or conception of play as a certain thing that happens and defining it in a certain way, and it looks like maybe, like say, play schemes or in council playgrounds and parks and things like that. And I think a tinge of guilt that I've overly sort of simplified it, because the other thing when we first started sort of working together was that I picked up quite early on, I'm trying to, what's the polite way of saying this, that you were quite determined to make a distinction between play work and play and playing.
Yes.
I didn't want to say the word obsessive, but
that would be fair.
But play work is a particular thing that is distinct, and that was something I found myself having to kind of coach myself not to kind of annoy you with. And I think this is kind of one of the principles for me behind some of this work and some of this kind of theory and the principles behind sort of doing this podcast and discussing it, is that you see reference to community development quite a lot, and you kind of go, well, it's community based. It's maybe it's maybe immersed in the community. It's well intended. Maybe it might one day become community development, but it's not at the moment. And I sense there's sort of a parallel between how you were describing play work and certainly the settings that you're probably kind of alluding to in what you just said in Wrexham, which are very unique. Yeah. And I don't think I've really encountered many in my sort of community development background or my personal background elsewhere in and around sort of Cardiff or South Wales.
I'm now very wary of maybe using community development in the wrong way, but but yeah, I think there is.
My own back.
Yeah, there is. I mean, play workers do it. Play workers use play as a shorthand for their roles, and it is one of my pet hates because it's completely misleading. Play is this thing that we talk about. Children do it, all right, and I know people say that all people play, and it's true. And people who play more are probably healthier and have happier lives generally. But there is something other about children. They are driven to relentlessly try and find opportunities for playing. And I think that adults do them a disservice when we use the word play for our own means. And what we've seen over recent decades, I think, is kind of adults, almost trying to take ownership of the word play. So what we'll do is children play because, there always has to be a why children play. So children play because it's about learning, or children play because it improves physical activity. That's not why children play. Children play because they are driven to do it and they're motivated to do it because of the pleasure they gain from doing it. It is that simple. And I think for Playworkers, we recognise that it's just about saying children are people, which I think itself gets overlooked. I made this point recently. We now call teenagers young people. I think in an attempt to show that we respect them more, we respect them as a person. But it doesn't mean if you're not yet a teenager, you're not even a young person. We don't really treat children often as people, but Playworkers do, and we say those kinds of people are very playful. That's what they do, and therefore we should support that, because they have a right as a person to do that stuff in their communities. And so for us, I think for Playwork, play is about the stuff that kids do for whatever reason they do it. But in saying that, we recognise that all kinds of benefits coming from them doing it. The irony is that when adults try and take ownership of that play and try and make it purposeful to get to their developmental outcome that they desire, we see adults getting involved and making play less playful. We actually end up, it's kind of our own worst enemy.
It's quite sort of powerful, I suppose, to say children do it. It's just its sheer intrinsic value.
That's actually what
the pleasure that they derive from it.
And actually, that's what the Welsh Government says. The definition in the play policy says it is freely chosen, personally directed, and intrinsically motivated. Like all definitions of play, you can pick some holes in that, because not everybody freely chooses to be picked last in the football. But there are unique qualities about play. It's more or less child-led. It's highly variable. It contains all these kinds of elements of uncertainty, and it is done for its own sake. And when adults kind of try and support it for some other kind of external goal, it isn't really playing. And children know it. That's the other big thing for me, is I think because they are, for children, it is an instinctive drive, it follows that they have some kind of instinctive awareness of what is enough playing. And where they get enough playing, they have a better attachment to the places, because they can recognise people who are supportive of play, they can recognise institutions that are supportive of play, and they can recognise communities that are supportive of play, and they're more attached to those kind of places. It's about recognising that children aren't.
So play workers get that?
Hopefully.
And when I say play workers, in the same way that there's a particular definition in your mind and in the sector's mind then about what is and what isn't play work, does that follow the same for what is and what isn't a play worker? And the reason I ask that, because in the community development sector, there's been for the last sort of few years this drive to professionalise it, and I always use that term advisedly, because there's a certain pejorative kind of connotation that throws up, but to develop and to articulate and to kind of form that consensus around values and principles, and then certainly more recently then to develop occupational standards. So a community development worker is somebody that does these things informed by these values and abiding by these principles, which is not to say that there are people doing those things who probably wouldn't for 1 second call themselves a community development worker. And certainly you've got the whole issue of whether people are doing that in a paid or unpaid capacity. Is there the same parallel then with people?
Yeah, I think so. And I think the really important point is, like you say there, I think there's been a danger in the past that it's kind of seen that people go, so play workers are the ones that work with play, therefore other people don't. And that's certainly not the case. And certainly in terms of the things we do with Ludicology and in Wrexham, we're saying that anybody who works with and on behalf of children and their families would be best placed to do so where they had a good understanding of children's play and how to work with it. And many of the problems we come across is where we work against children's innate playfulness. So everybody would be better off understanding children's play. But I do think Playwork has a distinct role in terms of being focused on play as the outcome, not coming at it from other adult prescribed outcomes, and being primarily concerned with cultivating these more favourable conditions and relating to children by supporting their play. And I think there is real value in that profession being appropriately recognised, and that's what Playwork has been trying to do. We were talking a bit before we were recording then about you saying kind of same happened in the development of community development work. Playwork came out of the junk playgrounds, the concept of which was brought to the UK from Denmark, and we used to call them play leaders, and we turned it into play workers because we kind of avoid this idea that adults are leading the play.
Yeah.
But it was through that emergence of playwork over probably 60 years that we then worked towards what we now call the Playwork Principles, which is an ethical framework that guides playwork practice. Now, only 8 principles, because I think it's a bit like play. It's very hard to pin down exactly what playwork is without kind of losing. That's one of the challenges with national occupational standards, isn't it? That as soon as you try and standardise, maybe you lose what is so special about something like community development and or playwork. But there is a sense that we need to be able to describe what playwork is and what playwork isn't, and that's what the Playwork Principles tried to do. But that stuff was only kind of introduced, around 2000 onwards. It was, I think, 2005 the Playwork Principles were actually endorsed. But those values and ideas had been developing for 40 years before that.
Yeah.
And I think within playwork there's certainly a shared appreciation of what playwork is. I don't think that playwork's always been very good at articulating what it is, and that's maybe why it's not as well known as it should be.
People tend to have the conversations with each other. There's obviously things within that almost very sort of closed shop. Community development's the same. Communities First as a programme is the same. Yeah. We talk to each other about things. We learn from each other. We don't necessarily tell other people or sort of stakeholders perhaps sort of looking in. And certainly not those people who don't get it or don't want it for whatever reason. No, I can certainly see the parallel there. Yeah,
and I think part of it actually comes down to, again, going back to that thing as play as an outcome. It's all about how we construct childhood and play in the UK, and the fact that play isn't really currently seen as a legitimate outcome in its own right. Play is not as important as learning, or play is not as important as sport, or these other things that we, in our society we value more than playing. Although the irony is that for children, playing is probably the most important one. But play workers suffer a bit with that, and I think they kind of have felt a bit like kind of secondary professionals. They don't have the same status as teachers or whoever else in children's lives. But if play was really valued and people really understood what happens when you work in support of play, then I think that position might change.
So is the part of the role of a play worker, this probably is as much kind of part of a job description, not part of the job description as much as it probably ought to be. Is it about persuading others, persuading funders, persuading the powers that be, persuading political leaders, community leaders of its intrinsic value, that it as an outcome is enough in itself? Because again, the parallel with community development, or a more, in my mind, perhaps sort of traditional non-play work context, would be, empowered communities, good thing.
Yes.
So why do we have to justify it?
Yeah.
Or why do we have to justify activity that is leading to that, or hoping to lead to that? Yeah. To such an extent, why do we have to write, long-winded funding applications and all the rest of that, if it is clearly so worthwhile a goal in itself?
Yeah.
And I think something else you wrote in that initial brief was about the extent to which playworkers support the development of positive attitudes towards children. And I think that kind of corrected me, or sort of wrong-footed me almost, where you kind of think, okay, they're just, a bit flippantly, supervising kids playing. They're just focused on the children. There's an occasion where they have to actually articulate or argue even within the corridors of power, so to speak. Yeah. With elected members in a local authority, for instance. Yeah, and I think there's all kinds of... advocacy is one of the Playwork Principles, and I think it's advocacy at many levels. Yeah. So, I, as a play worker, I don't actually do any work with kids hardly now. I still count myself as a play worker, but, I spend most of my time advocating to strategic decision makers, funders, elected members, and parents and other professionals. We've got play workers out today in public spaces, and they'll be doing a lot of stuff around advocating, maybe in a very kind of subtle way, to parents and people wandering past. We've often said, that almost how many cups of tea you make should be used as some kind of measure for play work,
because that's what they spend loads of time doing. They help parents to feel more confident, and you do that by getting to know them. Yeah. You're not the play worker, you're Mike or you're whoever, that is looking after, is keeping an eye on your kids, but not keeping such an eye on them that they're... One of the things that we have in Playwork is saying, look, your kid can walk off the site if they want to. That's a big thing. And that requires then trust between parent and child, that the child's going to stay there if that's what they've agreed, or that they are capable of walking home on their own, and trust between parent and play worker that we're kind of going to look out for them, but can't, hold us completely responsible for what happens. So I think there's all kinds of little bits of advocacy, but really maybe conversations is a better word. I think there's all kinds of conversations to be had about children and their position within communities, and that stuff has to happen on a day-by-day basis. Also, sometimes I think it is really taking a stand. I've seen play workers do that who won't allow children's rights to be railroaded. I think there's a real kind of justice issue around children in communities, particularly around spatial justice, and this idea that it's very easy to overlook children's rights because they have less power. And so often adult decisions and preferences get prioritised, sometimes at the expense of children. And it's not about saying we should prioritise children's rights over adults, but it's about a more equal distribution.
Absolutely.
And so I think there is often play workers are kind of mediating between child and adult agendas and just giving children more of a voice and going, look, this is also okay. But where play workers are in communities for long periods of time, actually you go to them and the relationships between children and adults are really positive.
And tackling, well, certainly in the first place, identifying and drawing attention to those power imbalances then, or inequalities, doing something to maybe address them, or maybe even them out a little bit more, is that was bread and butter then to someone calling themselves a community development worker. And I suppose you could argue that actually the label is almost irrelevant. Doing that. The community with whom you're doing that, whether it's children, young people, whether it's with communities of interest based around ethnicity or other characteristics, whether it's to do with what's been primarily my background, areas of deprivation, disadvantage, you're having to redress those power balances. And sometimes some of the most deeply rooted ones are not between the haves and the have-nots, so to speak, but within the have-nots, where you've got people perhaps with a political background or trade union background or just some sort of very prominent sort of community role representing, in inverted commas, the community making decisions. And although that's important, and additional representative form of democracy is, is a staple of our society, you can do it in a participative way, and the power struggles that have come about where, your traditional councillor has found his or her role a little bit sort of undermined. Have been absolutely fascinating to see up close. But, as you say, you can sometimes get caught in the middle, particularly if you're employed by that local authority, or that councillor is, he's got the portfolio for the programme that you're funded by.
And I think Playwork is political, and it has certainly been at the centre of many political issues within communities. It was interesting in a community recently, and they were looking at consultation around the redevelopment of some of the housing, which is really positive, but there's potential that what often happens is that, again, children's need to access time and space is sometimes overlooked, and that maybe adult priorities are given greater emphasis. But then the play workers take the children into the consultation, and it's not always an easy situation for adults to be in, but it does start to kind of change those kind of processes, and maybe there is kind of, it does enable something that is a little bit more democratic, or at least something that is a little bit more just. But as a consequence, Playwork is always going to be closely tied to political issues.
Absolutely, and there's no. We sometimes hear this within communities first about we've got to be apolitical or non-political. Well, the reality is what we're talking about is the redistribution of wealth and resources and power. If that's not politics, then I don't know what is.
No, exactly.
And that's been the case for thousands of years.
And maybe it's politics at a local level and with a small p. And
to a certain extent, we need to embrace that. Now, clearly, there's a time and a place for when that should be partisan or whatever else, political with a big P, as they say. But I think it should be embraced. And if we're talking about trying to create a better better's the wrong word, more rounded, more fully engaged citizens. And we know there's a big democratic deficit in a lot of disadvantaged communities. Turnout in elections is very, very low. It's not great in other communities, mind.
No.
But it's particularly low in some areas. Then surely showing young people, or people at whatever formative age that they still might be, that there's merit in getting involved, there's merit in putting your view forward, that can only be a good thing. Again, it comes back to this thing, well, why do we have to kind of justify this? There's clearly an intrinsic value in it. They're the counsellors of tomorrow. They're the community leaders of tomorrow. They're the informed parents.
And they're the children of today. Indeed. That's a big part of it for me, is about how often do children meet an adult who is pretty much on equal terms with them. I think that Playwork spaces are pretty democratic spaces. They should be places where if children go, actually, we want to pull that down now, they can pull it down. And we want to use this space for this now, we want to do this thing now. This isn't, this is one of the reasons why you don't see kind of structured activities in these kind of sessions, is because adults might start something off, but if children want to do it another way, that's their prerogative, and that's actually it's pretty empowering for kids, really. I think that often, more so now than ever, I think that children spend time in environments that are supervised and run by adults, and those adults can overextend their authority. So I mentioned that you got certain unique provision within Wrexham. Some of the findings you've had from research have been, young people feel safer around or because of these settings, but also because of the play workers. So what else has been found? Because people have a greater sense of attachment to those communities. We did some work for the Wrexham second place efficiency assessment, where we were looking at different levels of satisfaction with opportunities for play in communities, and a couple of the places where children didn't just say it was good, but the majority of kids in that community said it was great, were the places where they had kind of sustained play work. And we went to speak to some of the kids in those schools. We didn't know whether they went to the Playwork settings, because not all kids do, but we went to the schools where kids had rated really high satisfaction, and we went and spoke to them. I was talking to the kids, and these were in some of the more, what would be seen as more economically deprived areas. We asked this group of kids, what's the thing that helps the most? And they're saying, without doubt, the adventure playground, which perhaps was no surprise. But what was really interesting, they then went on to talk about more about what the adventure playground did for them when they weren't at the adventure playground than what happens inside the adventure playground.
Right, okay.
So they started off by going, we pretended we didn't really know about the adventure playground. And they said, it's like, it's really, really dangerous, but you feel safe there. Right. Which I just think is children being brilliant at describing what an adventure playground is. But then they were saying it's when we're out in the community, we know we can go and find a play worker. And they were telling real stories of things that happened to them. They got chased by a dog. They could go and find the play worker. They forgot their coat and they were cold. They went and found a play worker. They needed a football. They went and found a play worker. There was some scary bloke chasing them. The play worker walked them home. When it got dark, they rang mum to say, kids on the way. These might seem like really little things, but to kids they're really big things. And they build up. What you get from that is a really trusting relationship of these adults out there who are keeping an eye, who are kind of making the community feel a bit safer, helping them get along with stuff. And as a consequence, what you see where you have sustained play work is this kind of culture of playing. In other research we've done in another place where there's a lot of there's been play work sustained for quite some time, parents saying, when my kids are out playing, I know I can go and call on other parents to find out where they are. And they got to know those parents from being around the edges of the play schemes. So-and-so down the road, he always gets the water slide out for us when the play scheme's here. We can go and fill up the buckets at their house. All these little ways in which adults become involved in children's play lives, but as a consequence meet other people. And it just makes their lives a little bit easier. They get a bit of respite when kids are out playing. They're a bit less stressed.
Which is why I'm kind of interested in this, and it's kind of, I suppose it's a penny belatedly dropping for me, is that it's not just about the children, it's about how that can help make, in that instance, slightly more cohesive communities, which might sound big and grand, because maybe what you're talking about is a little cul-de-sac of 20 houses, but then a lot of people will talk about how they don't know their neighbours anymore. We can overlook the significance of that at our peril.
Play is just a really important part of the human condition. And, you know, when we talk about community development and, you know, like you were saying, kind of redistributing power and stuff like that, often the ways in which we do that are through a form of playing or another, you know, whether it's kind of bringing people together to have a bit of a picnic or you have a water fight or what. Because playing is a pleasurable process and you're not judged in doing it. You know, it isn't done for some external reward. It's just something that everybody can do. It's an incredibly inclusive thing because it is so variable, so you can play in the way you want and be as involved as you like because it's totally voluntary. And I think there is something very powerful about adults being around children playing. I think that's some kind of evolutionary thing where we actually benefit from seeing kids having a good time, and that makes adults feel a bit easier around each other as well.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It's fascinating. We've been talking for half an hour, and I could probably talk for another couple of hours. Thank you, Mike. Do you want to give another little plug for yourself and Ludicology? Yeah, so people can visit the website ludicology.com, where we also do a podcast. So there's more on there really about the idea of about Playwork and about the concept of play sufficiency as a kind of organising principle for communities. If people are interested in this stuff, they can find out more there. And in terms of Wrexham, they can visit wrexham.gov.uk/play and find out more about what we're doing in and around Wrexham. And if anybody ever wants to come and visit stuff, we're always open. And a little plug for the play settings that we've been alluding to and we've had in mind, because I wasn't really aware of them, perhaps as much as I should, given I'd worked in Wrexham, as perhaps I should have been, because they're all completely independent of the local authority. Yeah, so they're funded through the local authority, but they are third sector organisations. I mean, it's funny you say that, because I think actually they're probably better known in other areas of the world than they are in Wrexham themselves. But there's I work for the play development team for the council, but then there's three other main partners, which is the Venture, Gwenver Valley Adventure Playground, and the Avow Play team, who run the land. But they also run other projects across the kind of urban villages cluster. But we have visitors from all over the world coming to Wrexham. It would be nice if we maybe made more of it in Wales, and particularly in Wrexham ourselves. So the land is in Plasmatic, isn't it? Yes, the land is in Plasmatic. Which is, what are we talking about, sort of 6-7 miles out of the town centre. Yes, the others are in the south of Wrexham, and then the other two are on the Kaya Park estate. And there has been a culture of play work in Wrexham for 35 years plus. But there are still many other places where good play work happens in the UK. Sure. Unfortunately, in Wales we have seen a significant reduction in it as a consequence of reductions in public funding. Yeah, which is an ongoing challenge for a lot of us in this sort of work. Mike, diolch yn fawr, thank you very much, and it'd be nice to do this again one time. Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.